Origin just OCG reaction. This is why France is actually preparing for war with Russia. But on real life lore. Yeah, this has been like blowing up recently a lot. I think Task and Purpose recently also made video about it. About how France is becoming more active. Now, I don't know. I think that if Ukraine gets captured, France would have a bigger threat. Or some overseas territory or something. I don't know what's more detail about that. Obviously, this video will tell us. But yeah, this is a worrisome, isn't it? Because if we were to think, what is the 3 European countries that would be like historically has been the those countries that if they go to war it becomes a problem. It would be UK, France, and Germany, right? So France joining, if Germany joins in the future as well, that might be a bit too much. I think France joining itself directly would be, I don't know where that goes, right? I don't know where conflict will go. Will that be just like conflict of the old, where another country joins, okay, fight increases? Or, oh, this is just too much and nukes are involved. Who knows? But yeah, this is like a, risky thing. The president of France has been talking about this a lot, so I don't know where this is going to go. So let's watch this one. Remember, if you like more reaction, don't forget to subscribe, so that way I know which videos to react to more. Check out the reaction, there's a link in the description. And yeah, let's watch it.
As most of the world's attention remains focused on the major wars still ongoing in Ukraine and Gaza, there is another massive proxy war going on right now between the French and the Russians across the African continent that also has the potential to...
I just said it the first second I get the information. Yeah, it's about the overseas territories and things. That makes sense.
...send shockwaves around the entire rest of the world. For a moment last July in 2023, the world's attention was briefly focused on this emerging proxy war between Moscow and Paris when military officers in Niger, a large landlocked country in West Africa, orchestrated a coup d'etat and overthrew the country's government. It was a particularly shocking development because Niger was the 6th country in only 3 years since 2020 in Africa's Sahel region to experience its government getting successfully overthrown in a coup. Following the previous successful coups that toppled governments in Mali in 2020 and 2021, in Chad, Sudan, and Guinea all in 2021, then in Burkina Faso in 2022, and then finally in Niger in 2023, which established this continuous belt of recently couped countries across the whole...
Yeah, I mean, they just took the whole belt, look at that.
...of Africa, from the Red Sea to the Atlantic, a geopolitical region that some analysts have started to controversially refer to as Africa's coup belt. And after the coup overthrew the government in Niger in July of 2023, another coup broke out nearby in Gabon only a month later in August that overthrew the longtime government there as well. The coup belt overlaps some of the most violent conflicts going on in the world that tragically fail to attract the international attention that they deserve. With an apocalyptic civil war still raging in Sudan between rival generals that exploded in April of 2023, and with large swaths of territory across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger currently dominated by radical Islamist factions like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that might be on the brink of unilaterally declaring their own independent jihadist states. After the collapse of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and after the expulsion of Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, both groups have reformed themselves and recentered their primary territorial bases of operations away from the Middle East towards here in the Sahel region, amidst the chronic instability in the coup belt. And tens of thousands of people have lost their lives and millions more have been displaced in the process. For the very first time since the Global Terrorism Index began compiling records 13 years ago, a country other than Afghanistan or Iraq climbed into the #1 spot for deadly terror attacks in 2023. And it wasn't Israel, even after the widely publicized scale of Hamas's October 7th attack. It was Burkina Faso, who suffered nearly 2,000 deaths from terrorism in 2023 alone, that represented nearly a quarter of all terrorism-related deaths worldwide, and represented a surge of terrorism-related violence in the country, up 68% compared to 2022. And neighboring Mali wasn't far behind it in 3rd place overall, suffering more deadly terrorism in 2023 than either Pakistan or Syria. This has made the tri-point border region between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger the new epicenter of global terrorism in the 21st century, as much of it has fallen under the direct control of either ISIS or Al-Qaeda. There is a genuine fear that...
Okay, that is insanity. How the fuck this wasn't part of the news if it's that scale, right? Those African countries are now like epicenter of terrorism now. What the fuck? There was an attack in Russia recently, right? Was it in Bank or something? A lot of people died. It was like a terrorist attack. Who knows what that is, right? Something like that. There's also like ISIS involved, something. I don't know much detail about that. I'm guessing this video will cover it, but we'll see.
that many of these countries may be on the verge of imminent state collapse. And with the sole exception of Sudan, who has its own problems, all of these unstable and fragile countries in Africa's Coup Belt are former, and arguably still current economic, if not political, colonies of France. That in nearly every case were home to thousands of French troops, who were ostensibly there fighting against the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but who were also there to defend major French economic interests before the coup leaders took power and expelled them from the country. Since the coups overthrew governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, French troops and even the French ambassadors have all been collectively expelled. As a wave of anti-French sentiment sweeps across the continent, and in nearly every instance, the expulsion of French troops and French ambassadors have been met with a welcoming of hundreds to even thousands of new Russian troops from the mercenary Wagner Group in the newly rebranded Russian Africa Corps to fight against the ongoing insurgencies instead, as the spaces on the board in West Africa begin rapidly.
Okay, information flowing too fast before I can pause. First, I was gonna say, okay, I understand France is there at fighting terrorism, but why you still there? Still colony shit is going on with the France, and after watching a lot of French video, I know like France is still keeping certain territories with whatever legal term that is. But isn't this fucked up? With this was happening in World War I. It's still happening now, right? Because of Europe, certain European countries, what is happening in Africa? Because they're part of technically colony or something, whatever, right? But obviously, first I thought they're overthrowing them because they're French and they're like, okay, this is old shit, like we need our country back or whatever. But then like you're inviting Russian troops now. So is this like political thing going in the background between Russia and France? What is happening, right? First it's like, okay, they're kicking out colonizer, France, great. Okay, then it's like they're bringing back Russians, like, okay, how is that great? So it's like confusing element here, right? So I would think like, France was still like holding certain territories economically. There is like a big issue there, right? With certain, I'm pretty sure Real Life Lore video made a video about the Real Life Lore about how France is a certain African colony because of certain economical issue. There's like a big friction in France. There were like big protests and things like that. Something like that. France is still holding on to certain colonies. But if you're going to kick them out, why are you bringing in Russia there, right? That's the question here. That's the issue here. And I don't know what to think. Is Russia playing in the background? Is that what's happening here?
Shifting like falling dominoes away from France's sphere of influence and towards Russia's. It's a complicated proxy war that overlaps the struggles between West African nations, tribes, and ethnicities themselves, that is directly challenging France's long, profitable, and largely invisible neo-colonial domination over their former directly ruled colonies in Africa, that has continued on for generations after most Westerners believed it all ended. It is directly threatening the foundation that France has built its prosperity upon for centuries. And it appears to be a theater of Russia.
Yeah, it is fucked up, man. Not gonna lie. Look, I don't know what the element are there. I don't know if France is fighting, terrorism or not. But it is economically tied. And why are you still holding on to like, African colonies? It's like, what the fuck, man? Most people left. Most European left. Like in today's world, nobody thinks like, there are still Africa's are still European colonies there, right? Like France is still holding on to them. That was the issue with the protests that happened, major protests a few years ago, right? Because something tied to the certain colony in Africa. Why are you still holding on to it? This is kind of fucked up. So I understand like coups and kicking out France, but letting in Russia, what's that? Like you're replacing one with another? What's happening?
Russia's war with the West that Moscow is currently winning, and that hardly anybody in the Western world ever reports on or really even understands. And so, in order for you to understand why Russia is beating France here, why the Sahel region of Africa has become so unstable in the 2020s, and why it's all so important to the outcome of both Europe and Africa's future, it helps to understand the uniquely exploitative history of French colonialism in Africa, and the uniquely long-lasting vestiges of French neo-colonialism in Africa that have persisted long past all of the other former European colonial regimes in Africa into the present day, and how this all intersects with geography, climate change, and Russia's own current geopolitical objectives and ambitions. The Sahel region is a very long and narrow band of arid land that runs across the African continent for more than 3,500 kilometers or 2,200 miles from the Red Sea in the east to the Atlantic in the west. It is a biogeographical transitional zone between the vast deserts of the Sahara to the north and the wet savannas and rainforests further to the south. And its name Sahel is derived from the Arabic word for shoreline, the shore of the sandy Sahara Sea. Across thousands of years of history, inland trading ports on this shore of the Sahara made the region an epicenter of global trade, and one of the wealthiest regions in the world. Cities like Timbuktu and Gao in modern-day Mali became major trading hubs in the medieval period between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean, as vast camel trains carried the region's natural and human resources like gold, ivory, and slaves northward and luxury goods southward, which brought enough wealth and prosperity to the Sahel that Timbuktu was once one of the biggest cities in the world in the 14th century, and it was the core of the empire of Mansa Musa, who is often regarded as potentially having been the richest human being to have ever lived. But then, beginning in the 15th century, European trading vessels began sailing down the African west coast and opened up new maritime trading routes for these resources between sub-Saharan Africa and the European world instead. The trade routes shifted from the inland ports in Timbuktu and Gao towards the new maritime ports in places like Ghana and Ivory Coast, and the economic fortunes of the Sahel began declining over the following centuries. By the time of the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century, the relatively small French colonial empire in Africa that had already been established in modern-day Algeria, Senegal, and Gabon was dramatically expanded along arbitrary lines to cover nearly the entirety of the continent's west and the vast majority of the Sahel region. The French colonial empire then rapidly expanded across the continent without taking into consideration the historically important overland camel trading routes that were still important for the region's nomadic peoples who had no concept.
Camel trading routes? What the how you go from that to all the way that, right? This is a 2D map, right? If you make this into 3D, this Sahel region stretches out more, so it's like longer than you can see here, right? That's how it is. And how the fuck you gonna go across the whole, width of that? The whole, line of Sahel region is very, very long. How many miles is that? Kilometers, whatever. How do you go from there to there? I guess it will take months or something. I don't know.
Of nation-states or settled societies. Nor did the French take into account biogeographic realities like the ecological differences between the Sahara, the Sahel, and the wetter southern regions. And nor did the French take into account the boundaries of various ethnic groups or consider the differences between nomadic groups and settled groups. The French colonial authorities, like the rest of the Europeans who carved up Africa at the time, were exclusively interested in acquiring the region's rich natural resources, establishing their own authority, and crushing local political rulers. And unlike other
France was only interested in resources, we know that. That was the thing of all European colonies. Just take shit from there. That was the thing, right? I know people will justify this and all the political bullshit, but in the end, it just sucked out resources. That's what that happened.
19th and 20th century European colonial projects in Africa, the French went so far as to declare in 1848 that Algeria was being annexed directly into the French nation itself. Algeria therefore extended beyond a mere colony from the perspective of Paris, and for more than a century until the 1960s, it was regarded as a core integral part of France the same way as Paris. Hundreds of thousands of European French settlers came to colonize Algeria following the 1848 annexation, to the point where by 1959, still under French control, there were around 1.4 million French settlers present in Algeria, who represented about 13% of Algeria's entire population at the time. After the conclusion of World War II, in which France had been occupied by Nazi Germany for years, the French economy was in ruins, and France's post-war leaders sought to use their...
I'm not gonna lie, that I don't know what this... Okay, I don't know if this real-life Lord's genius or just happened to be that, right? He's talking about France's dominance, France's colonization, how long it lasted, all the way to early, around World War I and things. It was still that many millions were in Algeria. And then suddenly it shows Hitler screaming out of his lungs. So first that happened and then that happened. There you go, Europe in a nutshell, there you go.
vast colonial project in Africa to maintain their status as a global great power going forward, and to try competing with the Americans and the Soviets as much as possible. Part of this included France's idea to push back against the US-dominated global financial system that emerged after the war by establishing a brand new currency for all of their African colonies in 1945 that they called the CFA Frank, an acronym that in French stood for the French Colonies in Africa Frank. The CFA franc to be used in France's African colonies was to be pegged directly to the French currency, the French franc, in a way that was deliberately designed to strengthen the French franc against the US dollar in the post-war world. The French franc was devalued near the end of 1945 in order to establish a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar, and by 1948, the CFA franc was pegged to the French franc at a rate of 2 French francs to 1 CFA franc, which spared the CFA franc from going through the same devaluation as the French franc did and deliberately overvalued the CFA franc relative to the French franc. Essentially, what this meant in practice was that the colonies using the CFA franc would experience higher costs to export their raw materials to anywhere that wasn't France, since France would benefit from the frictionless conversion between their currencies.
I was about to say, like, you don't want your currency to go that strong, for many complicated business related things. But then when you say, oh, because there was a reason behind it. If you do the trading to France, it's like cheaper. Oh, then now it makes sense.
Which ultimately crushed the competitiveness of CFA franc user exports to anywhere that wasn't France. While at the same time, it also made the colonies' imports of manufactured goods from France less expensive than from anywhere else, which essentially enabled France to import raw materials from their African colonies for below market rates and then sell them back finished products for above market rates. And with the direct convertibility of the CFA franc being directly pegged to the French franc, French companies could open up mines and operations in the colonies and extract their resources, while easily sending their profits back home to France without—
That's called economical colonization. Oh, that's not our colony anymore. We've left. This is not like, oh, this is not 20th century, 19th century. We're in living 21st century. No, you're still like complicated things you already created colony. Like they're dependent on you and they're only going to trade with you, mostly.
without the fear of foreign exchange fluctuations. It was a great system and deal for the French, and it enabled Paris to partially fund their post-World War II economic recovery through a rather sly wealth transfer from their African colonies to themselves. But by the mid-1950s, there was increasing sentiment rising among the Africans for their independence from Europe. In the beginning, France initially responded to these calls for independence in their colonies with overwhelming violence. In 1954, Algeria rose up in a revolution to shake off the French settler colonial project there, and what followed was a brutal 7-year war for independence. The French were particularly ruthless in crushing the Algerian independence movement because Paris still officially considered Algeria to be a core integral territory of France itself. The French army committed brutal and wide-scale massacres and other atrocities across Algeria, and across the 7 years of war, it's estimated that around 1 million Algerians were killed. At least 8,000 Algerian villages were destroyed, and more than 2 million Algerians were rounded up and placed into French-run concentration camps. The French also treated the sparsely populated Algerian Sahara as their testing ground for nuclear weapons during the war as well. Testing and
I'm not gonna lie, that is fucked up. Nobody knows this, right? I'm learning this more from real life lore than any other sources, right? And I have a reaction channel, right? I react to a lot of videos, as some of you already know. I'm only finding out from real life lore. There's not much, channels and things that really talks, not channel, news medias, let's just say, not just YouTube, that talks about this, right? You already talk about like atrocities in World War II, atrocities here and there. Mostly European things. You don't hear about like how France basically did all this shit to Algeria, how France is holding out to a lot of their colony way late than most people left theirs, right? So yeah, it's like one of the guy who said it, like, I don't know, if it's like Indian, like foreign minister or something, like, Europe has this mentality. The Europe's problem is world's problem, but world problem is not Europe's problem. That's basically what this is. This is insane, man. You hear about Europe shit all the time, but not the other things around it.
Detonating a total of 17 nukes in the country between 1960 and 1966 that exposed thousands of locals to radiation. Over time, the Algerian War's brutality and high costs gradually turned French public opinion against it, as did international support for the war from France's allies like the United States, which eventually forced France to concede and grant Algeria its independence in 1962, which led to a mass exodus of more than 900,000 of the French settlers who lived in Algeria back to metropolitan France, who were terrified of suffering Algerian reprisals. And as all of this brutality and horror was very publicly going on for the whole world to see in Algeria, France began attempting to hang on to the rest of their African colonies through more covert, less expensive, less bloody, and less internationally damaging methods. After having pressed the CFA Frank currency on them in 1945, the French essentially hijacked and co-opted genuine independence movements in the rest of their West African colonies by courting, influencing, and placing their hand-picked local elites into positions of power, as essentially puppets before offering them their theoretical independence. Each of these colonies were then offered so-called cooperation agreements by Paris that would define their future relationship with France going forward post-independence. These agreements differed from colony to colony. They sometimes granted French companies continued privileged access to their natural resources. They sometimes enabled the French to continue maintaining military bases in their countries. But they always advised the colonies to continue remaining within the CFA Frank financial system. The colonies accepting these cooperation agreements and remaining within the CFA Frank system after 1958 was and has always been presented by the French as being a supposedly completely voluntary arrangement, where they were all free to say yes or no post-independence. But the French also made it extremely clear what would end up happening to any of these future countries post-independence if they rejected the arrangement. Guinea was the only one of France's colonies in Africa who flat-out rejected France's offers post-independence in 1958, including remaining within the CFA Frank system, with Guinea's then leader Sékou Touré defiantly declaring during a speech in front of France's then President Charles de Gaulle that he preferred to be poor in freedom rather than rich in slavery. And the French decided to make as painful an example out of him and of Guinea as possible. The French agreed to fully withdraw from Guinea and granted them their independence.
Yeah, basically, de Gaulle basically looked at him and said like, oh, you said that, not me. And just, I'm guessing they just like economically bankrupt them completely.
Early. But on the way out, they deliberately tore down and destroyed everything that they could that they considered to have been French contributions to Guinea society. They destroyed machinery, burned their plans for the capital's sewage system, destroyed their medicine rather than leave it behind, and even unscrewed their light bulbs in their offices and took them all back to France. All French foreign aid to Guinea was eliminated, and after Guinea subsequently turned towards the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc for financial experts to help them develop their own independent currency in 1959, the French took it as a—
I'm not gonna lie, that is the stupidest shit I've ever heard, right? All of those are not French inventions, right? If you be that kind of petty, they will find someone else like Soviet Union or somebody else to do it. Yes, they'll become kind of their puppet, but they will not become your puppet, right? So this is not how global politics works, right? You should have been like more clever with it than anything else. Not be this kind of petty, but they actually took out the balls like, oh, this is mine, right? And usually that's why independence happens with violence most of the time, right? So whoever they're taking independence from, don't just like destroy things and take things like, oh, this is ours, right? And one would just basically say like, oh, they're not wrong, it is theirs, why would not they take it? Yeah, you kind of enslaved those people economically, whatever way you want to call it, for years, right? Where they couldn't either raise their economy or make their own thing. You were there, right? Now you're finally going to be, at least you can do is like leave things that they already have. That's how it works, right? British didn't just destroy all the trains and things that are already in India, right? So it's like both sides go, right? You basically made them into your colony. You just sucked you're gonna give back the resources that you stole all this time. So at least leave things that is already there. Like, that's very petty to destroy everything, right? So that's just insane.
A direct threat to their CFA Frank system, and so they began flooding Guinea with counterfeited Guinean currency to try and generate hyperinflation and crash their economy. And they even started to begin arming Guinean rebels. And when responding to other threats in Africa against their neo-colonial system, the French responded with similar violent methods. A Cameroonian anti-colonialist leader of the era, named Félix Roland Morny, was assassinated by the French Secret Service in Switzerland in 1960, using a method evoking the current assassinations carried out by Vladimir Putin against his enemies in Europe. They poisoned him with radioactive thallium and gave him an agonizingly painful death. In 1957, just before the colonies began getting offered their deals on independence, French geologists—
I'm not gonna lie, this is pissing me off. Yeah, post World War II, things were in peace. Peace in Europe, you mean, right? This kind of a shady shit that we see Putin doing now. France was doing that to like African colonies and things. This is why Putin always, like, whenever you say something, smugly just fights back and what about this and what about that? Because he just sees this like, what, now you draw the line, right? Even post World War II, you did all this shit to other colonies and things, right? You employed the same methods that I'm doing now, right? And now because like few decades and you're not doing, so I'm not allowed to do type of way. It's like, yeah, I'm an a-hole, but you were the same way. You can't just like, so this is insane, right? This is 1957 we're talking about. Look at that. If this was like, around World War II or before that, or when all the like, European Union and everything and the peace talk, NATO and things like that, when all these organizations came to be, if all these things stopped, I would have been like, yeah, okay, things are of the past, not now. But this is post World War II. This is when the Cold War was going on, right? So they're still doing the shit that Putin's doing now. That is insane.
Geologists discovered large uranium reserves in a remote part of northern Niger. And as it turned out, Niger had the 7th largest known reserves of uranium in the entire world, and the highest quality uranium ore that has ever been discovered on the African continent. Initially, the French wanted continued access to this uranium in Niger to develop their own independent nuclear weapons arsenal, so that they could achieve strategic autonomy from both the United States and the Soviet Union. But later on, they also wanted continued access to Niger's uranium to power their burgeoning nuclear energy industry. The first commercial French-owned uranium mines in Niger were opened in 1971, and Niger's uranium has ever since become a majorly important component of France's energy strategy. No other country in the world has pursued nuclear power as aggressively as the French have, to the point where today in 2024, the country is home to 56 nuclear reactors in 18 separate nuclear power plants that generate roughly 63% of France's total electricity output. In order to fuel them and continue generating all of that electricity, France currently requires around 8,000 tons of raw uranium ore per year. And without any uranium within France's own borders.
Oh my god. So Niger going away from France's grasp, they will have a problem now to acquire nuclear things. So how are they going to run their plants? That is insane. I mean, obviously, like, when you think about this, like, this will cause issues, because when it comes to like power, what is oil, what is electricity and things, right? What is gas? Why was that an issue? Same thing is nuclear, right? Power is the thing, like literal power, like 70% power comes from nuclear in France. If you take them off from it, they're basically going to be aggressive. So now it makes sense of why France is preparing to go to war with Russia.
All of it has to be imported from abroad. Kazakhstan is by far the modern world's single largest producer of uranium, accounting for 43% of the entire world's production of it as of 2022, while Niger, by comparison on a global scale, is a fairly minor player, producing—
Hold up, where is US getting it from? Canada? That's just 15%, man. I'm guessing other places like Australia, Namibia, things like that. Because I'm pretty sure Kazakhstan is like, kind of like, like economically tied with Russia in a way, right? Because Russia is saying, yeah, you're not part of Russia anymore, but watch out type of way. Cold threat. So is Kazakhstan selling to US all this thing? Because I don't know. Yeah, this makes sense, right? Like, so, Russia would basically either like gun for Kazakhstan or make sure Kazakhstan stays in their side, so they can get enough uranium that way.
Only about 5% of the world's supply. But because of the way that the CFA Frank financial system has always worked in France's former colonies for decades after their theoretical independence, Niger's exports have always been expensive and uncompetitive, unless they are exported to France, who was able to use their own undervalued currency that was pegged to the overvalued CFA Frank to purchase them for below their market value. Niger had no other choice but to sign grossly unfair deals with French multinational companies that exploited their uranium resources and brought them back to France. Orano, the multinational.
Hold up, I thought France has like euro now. Isn't like entire European Union countries have euros as their thing? So how does that work now, right? If it would work with France, wouldn't it work with all the other European countries because they are all using euros? Wouldn't that like CFA would be now converting to euros now? Or like, how does euro work? Like, all these other countries, like, France's own currency then converts to euro. Is that what's happened?
Uranium mining company that's headquartered in Paris, that is currently 90% owned by the French government, currently operates 3 uranium mines in Niger, though only one of them continues to remain in active operation today as of 2024. And even though Niger is a fairly minor uranium producer globally with 5% of worldwide uranium production, it continues to be a major source of French uranium imports to this day. Kazakhstan, as the world's largest uranium producer, is also France's largest uranium supplier, having provided roughly 37% of France's uranium imports in 2022. But Niger is still France's second largest source of uranium imports, having provided 20% of French imports the same year. This meant that...
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, look, Taiwan is so important to US because of transit and things, right? I'm guessing Kazakhstan also supplies US. So I'm surprised Kazakhstan hasn't become that country where they fight Russia for or something, right? Like Kazakhstan supplies France, right? How is Russia not getting pissed off like, well, just give me or something, whatever, right? Because Russia is just there, right? I'm pretty sure there's a lot of monopolies Russia has there. A lot of silent threats to Kazakhstan that Russia gives, I guess, in certain economical ways. So I'm surprised that they're actually supplying like that.
That in 2022, 80% of all the uranium produced in Niger by French-owned multinational companies like Orano was exported to France, which went on to power roughly 12.5% of France's total electricity. Or, in other words, about 8 million French citizens continue to rely on the importation of uranium from Niger to power their homes. Niger's uranium has therefore remained a core strategic interest for France into the present day. Meanwhile, for Niger, despite mineral mining like uranium taking up 40% of the country's export volume, it only accounts for about 3% of the country's GDP, because very little of the profits from uranium mining have ever remained within Niger. And the uranium of Niger weren't the only raw materials in France's colonial empire that Paris wanted to maintain their access to after granting them their independence.
To me, that is insane. Only 3% GDP out of all that resources that are getting sucked out of there. Niger should just say like, you know what, 3%, I think we can withstand it, fuck it. We're not going to export this, we're going to just keep this for ourselves or whatever, right? Because people need uranium. Figure it out, I don't know, we need more profit. This is like the basic way I can say it without going too deep into how economics work, right? But even at the basic level, you can say, I don't know, figure out economics, I need more. 3% is like nothing, right? Out of all these resources, we need more money than that. Figure it out, I don't care. Screw your whatever, CFA or whatever that is, right? Or other countries as well, you need uranium, USA, you need uranium, figure it out or something. This is insanity, man.
Independence. Significant oil deposits were discovered in Gabon when it was still directly ruled as a colony by France in 1931. And after Gabon's theoretical independence in 1960, the French also wanted to maintain their access to the oil just like they did with Niger's uranium. In the mid-1960s, a Gabonese man named Omar Bongo was essentially interviewed by French President Charles de Gaulle for the position of Gabon's president, and appointed shortly thereafterwards. Bongo was an ardent Francophile who ruled the country for decades afterwards, all the way until 2009. And then his young son, Ali Bongo, took over and continued the pro-French dictatorship in Gabon until he was finally overthrown just last year, in August of 2023. Throughout the decades that the Bongos ruled the country, they enabled the precursor of today's giant French oil company Total to dominate Gabonese oil production in exchange for an annual bribe that sometimes amounted to 50 million.
I wonder why people are, rebelling. I wonder why. This is insane. All the way to now. This shit has been going on since de Gaulle's time to all the way now. This is insane. Of course, people now with the internet and like information being free and widespread, people are going to see this shit one way or another, right? People are going to realize this. Of course, they're going to revolt. This is insanity, man. France needs to figure out more better economical strategy if they want to keep monopolies of their older colonies, where colonies benefit and so do they, rather than just like be extreme at where colonies suffer and some of France still profit. That is an insane strategy. This is not 20 or 19th century, right? Figure shit out, man. If you want to keep monopolies on these things, what you get out of that is like you have monopolies over that thing. Colonies still profit, right? Older colonies, African countries still profit. If they're going to do business with somebody else, they're going to profit. They're going to profit with you, but they're going to get stuck with you because you're a former colony. So both have profit from it. Figure something out like that rather than people rebelling and literally kicking you out. That's going to end up worse, much worse for you.
Euros a year. In 1988, the New York Times reported that France was covering about 1/3 of the Bongo government's budget in Gabon, most of which flooded into Omar Bongo's own personal accounts, enabling the Bongos themselves to get ludicrously rich while the French were able to maintain their privileged access to the country's oil and other resources, while also maintaining a permanent military presence in the country too. In 1999, a U.S. Senate investigation into Citibank discovered that Omar Bongo had about $130 million stashed in the bank's personal accounts, which alone made him one of the wealthiest heads of state in the world. Despite Gabon's oil-dominated GDP per capita growth being among the highest in Africa during his more than 40 years in office, his government only paved about 5 kilometers worth of roads per year while he was in charge. And Gabon continued to have one of the world's highest rates of infant mortality at the time of his death in 2009, while 1/3 of the population continued living in poverty, largely because the Bongo family hoarded all of the nation's wealth for themselves and for France. Omar Bongo apparently said at one point that Gabon without France is like a car with no driver, and France without Gabon is like a car with no fuel. The Bongo family was so exorbitantly
because without France you don't have a car anymore. You might get a train or plane now, which is better.
Wealthy from their decades of corruption and exploitation of their own people for the benefit of France that in 2007, his daughter-in-law made a bizarre appearance on the US music channel VH1's reality TV show, Really Rich Real Estate, where she attempted to buy a $25 million mega mansion in Malibu, California. France's deep and endearing grip over its former colonies in West Africa after granting them their theoretical independence in the early 1960s became so unique and so
How fucked up it is that it's literally like the colonies are just stretched such a perfect way that it literally looks like France is like making them puppet. Look at that. It's literally below them.
Encompassing that it gave rise to a new term to describe the phenomenon known as France-Afrique, French Africa. To protect its continued economic interests across France-Afrique, the French launched no less than 122 separate military interventions into Africa just between 1960 and the mid-1990s, including the
special operations in a way.
of French Marines and tanks to Gabon in 1990 to help put down riots that erupted against their puppet Omar Bongo's rule. And ever since France's West African colonies were granted their theoretical independence in 1960, the CFA Frank system has remained largely in place for decades to the continued benefit of France. Its name has changed over the decades to what it currently is, an acronym in the French language for the Financial Community of Africa Frank, rather than the old French colonies in Africa Frank, though its original purpose has largely remained intact. Some countries have withdrawn from the system, as Guinea did early on and as Madagascar and Mauritania each did in 1973, while others have joined that were never original French colonies to begin with, like Equatorial Guinea in 1985 and Guinea-Bissau in 1997. It is still ultimately used by 14 countries in West and Central Africa today, though, the majority of whom used to be directly ruled as colonies from Paris. And ever since 1999, after France adopted the euro, the CFA franc currency simply evolved to become pegged to the euro instead of the old French franc. The current peg, as of 2024, has remained the same ever since 1999, and remains set at €1 equals precisely 655.957 CFA francs. Modern proponents of the CFA franc system continuing, which are very often French or European, point to the fact that the CFA franc being pegged to the euro has helped keep these 14 African countries' currencies stable and kept their inflation rates low when compared to their neighbors. For example, the inflation rate in Ivory Coast, which has always remained a CFA Frank user, has been markedly lower than what the inflation rate in neighboring Ghana has been, which has never been a CFA Frank user. Equatorial Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, two countries that were never French colonies and were therefore not original members of the CFA Frank back when it was originally conceived of in 1945, each decided to join the CFA Frank system later in 1985 and 1997 respectively, largely out of a desire to stabilize their own currency systems and to crush what at the time was their rampant inflation rates. The system is not completely without its merits, but the counter-arguments against the CFA Frank that largely come from Africans themselves revolve around a lot of notable issues. For one thing, because they're—
Look man, here's the thing. Of course, if you use CFA, it's gonna have stability because of European Union, because of Euro, right? Even before that, with the France, even though there's monopoly there, it was still stable. Now, countries where like, okay, like, certain countries that have like really good resources like uranium and things, eventually their currency will become stronger because they have something to trade which is better, right? Depending on many other factors, obviously. Look at Russia right now with all the sanctions and things, even before, Russian Federation during the Soviet Union, where the Iron Curtain and everything, Russia was stable enough, right? Because they have their own thing. So if you have a lot of natural resources that people want, your currency is going to be stable enough. But other countries who don't have that, yes, you're right. The currency is not going to be stable depending on a lot of factors. But then again, a lot of those factors are also like, European intervention in one way or another. So it depends, right? If they leave CFA, if like there is no European intervention a lot, if they do things right, there is a chance where like currency can be stable. Obviously, like this is like two maybes that I'm talking about. But there are, like I said, there are countries like, the country where like they export a lot of uranium but only makes like 3% of GDP. The countries like that would eventually become better with their own currency. So yes, all the countries that is like tied with CFA, some of them would suffer, some of them would profit more. Right now, as a general thing, yeah, they're basically right. Because of CFA, all of them are stable enough. But how stable? Is that really benefiting them? Are they seeing any progress? Right? Is it better to dump CFA now and create turbulence where your currency would collapse and things and eventually would stabilize? Because you will, whenever you dump CFA, that's going to happen anyway. So you need that time period where everything becomes turbulent before it stabilizes. So if you do it now, that's going to happen. If you do it in future, that's still going to happen.
Their currencies are directly pegged to the euro, their monetary policies are effectively still outside of their own sovereignty, and are still decided by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. And the European Central Bank has very different economic priorities than the CFA Frank countries in Africa do. The European Central Bank is primarily interested in combating inflation within the highly developed economies of the Eurozone in Europe, while most of the underdeveloped African countries who use the CFA franc are primarily interested in investing in infrastructure and creating jobs for their people, which are policies that drive inflation.
Basically what India had done for past multiple decades, China did before that, right? There's a lag between India and China for a few decades for whatever reason. Communism versus democracy, that's the reason. But yeah, basically what India has been doing and still kind of doing, right? In 30 years, India's priority would be change, right? I think China's priority has changed now or something. But yeah, basically that's what these countries need, right? Right now they need to focus on building things rather than anything else. If they want to like go above certain level, go above certain poverty level and things like that. India's big thorn is like the population with 1.4 billion or something. So the more you the more you realize, the more the area gets revealed like how much problem you have. So India's kind of battling with that. But all these countries can benefit, right? With certain same type of motto. So they'll eventually will have to think about that way rather than just keep the system of the past.
Inflation up. Historically, there was also a condition all the way up until 2019 that CFA Frank members had to maintain 50% of all their liquid reserves with the French Treasury in Paris for safekeeping. But even though that policy was removed via a reform in 2019, France still prints all of the CFA Frank currency in circulation, while the European Central Bank still effectively controls their monetary policy that is often against their best interests, which has led many people over many decades to argue that without any control over their own monetary policy, these countries in France-Afrique have never truly achieved their full sovereignty and independence from France. And so, their struggle for true decolonization has continued into the present day. And since these CFA Frank countries' exports to the Eurozone and imports from the Eurozone have remained cheaper than elsewhere, it has continued financially benefiting France and Europe, while also crippling their own abilities to make significant revenues from their exports, which has made export-driven economic growth in them largely impossible to achieve, and which has further discouraged any domestic industries in them from ever developing. And so for these reasons, while CFA
You know what, I have to go now, so I'm gonna pause here. Maybe I'll pick this up later. I'm definitely gonna pick this, not maybe, because this it's been a long time since I've seen a real left lore video that I'm this level of interest in. This is really good. This is like original style real left lore video. So yeah, so far it's been 20 minutes, but it's like a lot of information there. I'm guessing past other 25 minutes after this is gonna be why with the Russia and France thing is happening. I kind of already see it why it's happening, but yeah, it's gonna be more clear. As far as France thing, look, people are going to tell me in the comments like, you don't know shit, you don't know much about economy, this and that. Look, there are multiple elements of everything. That's going to be the case of everything. When we say anything decisively, it's going to be either this or that. We can only say like that. We can't say something openly like how politician does, right? So yes, any pro-France people in the comments can see France's point and say that. But in the end, certain points are more important than the other. And in the end, it's pretty shitty of France to basically keep holding on to this thing all the way there. Even in the 1950s, doing tactics that in today's world, people will say like, what the fuck? How basically Putin is doing, right? And that's in 1950s, post-World War II, which you're not thinking about France and any European country doing something like this. So when you really hear up, first of all, nobody basically talks about this, most people. Most news don't talk about it. Most people don't talk about it. Right? You always hear about European things, not things like this. So this is all kind of shitty. Forcing African colonies to be tied like that is kind of shitty. It's bad for France, right? This is going to turn out to be like France being left side and all this colony walking away, regardless of what outcome is. Better politics would be like finding the middle ground where Africa also profit, France also profit, but they both have monopolies. Both profit can that way. So this is kind of short-sighted and stupid as well. But I don't know. We'll pick up what happens more next time. But yeah, if you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.